And this is the configuration for the sticky secure MAC address. Port security, switch port security turns it on. Switch port security MAC address sticky. Turns on sticky, and you can see with the verification command that, again, port security is enabled, and configured MAC addresses is 0, and sticky MAC addresses is 1. So when you start seeing MAC addresses under the sticky MAC address, you know that this feature is enabled. This will also go into the quote-unquote, I gotta quit saying quote-unquote, the advanced lesson, in that you can configure both static MAC addresses and sticky MAC addresses under the same port. They suggest that you don't do that, and that makes sense, but you can do that. And here's the interesting part with sticky secure MAC addresses. So in this case, I've got fast Ethernet 0/1 configured with port security, and I'm saying let's go ahead and use sticky as our secure MAC address mode. So what happens now is that I'm going to go ahead and connect the device with the ABC MAC address to port fast Ethernet 0/1. When I do that, it dynamically learns that MAC address, and then it adds a line of configuration to the running configuration. We can see that here. It added a line of configuration, and switch port security MAC address, sticky ABC, which is basically the same syntax as the secure MAC address, but it just has sticky in the middle here. And that's pretty cool. This is, dynamically writing your configuration. One last time, well, I can't promise it's the last time. One more time, you need to recognize that this is only being added to the running configuration. So if you want this configuration, if you want this MAC address to be assigned to this port and to survive a reload, you're going to have to write your running configuration to your startup configuration. Okay, so we discussed how to limit the maximum number of MAC addresses per port with port security, as well as the 3 different methods for tying down specific MAC addresses to a specific port with port security. So we know how to set the rules. So what happens when these rules are broken? For instance, say that you've set a port to have a maximum number of 2 MAC addresses and a third MAC address appears, or you have a port that you've set for, a specific MAC address, but then a different MAC address is there. What's going to happen in those cases? Well, in those cases, it's going to trigger a security violation. There's actually 2 situations where a security violation is going to be triggered. Well, 3. They combined the first 2 that I just described into this paragraph, which is exceeding the maximum number of secure MAC addresses, and then a MAC address that is not included in that port's list of secure MAC addresses being present on that port. The second one is interesting and can bite you in the ass because it's a little counterintuitive. It says an address learned or configured on one secure interface is seen on another secure interface in the same VLAN. And this is one of those things that might not appear on your exam, but you're going to want to know for the real world. So let's take the instance where we just have a single switch. All the user ports are on a single VLAN, VLAN 100 for instance. And we've configured all the user ports for port security. And in our case, we're allowing 1 MAC address per port, and they're dynamically learned. So a user on fast Ethernet 0/1 gets up and says, I'm going to go over here and work from this cubicle for the day. So I unplug my network cable from my port on the wall, or from, let's go with port on the wall, and I walk over to the other cubicle and I plug it in. So now what I've done is I've moved from one port to another port on the Cisco switch within the same VLAN. In doing so, let's say that I haven't broken the maximum number of MAC addresses per port. Say this is the first MAC address being seen on that port, and also because they're being dynamically learned, I'm not breaking the rule for a MAC address appearing on this port that's not in its list of secure MAC addresses. So logically you say, okay, well, this guy's going to be on the network. Yeah, this is where in real life implementations this bit, if you're not aware of it, can come and be kind of a bugaboo. What Cisco iOS is going to do is it's going to say, I saw MAC address X on port 1, and now I'm seeing MAC address X on port 2. And both of these ports are running port security, so something goofy is going on. There's some monkey business. I'm going to go ahead and shut down port 2, which is the port that this poor user just connected to. Well, let me rephrase that. It's not necessarily going to shut down. It's going to invoke a security violation, and we'll see in the next set of slides what those security violations can be, but by default it is a shutdown. So the second little bullet point becomes pretty important if you're not aware of how this works, because you might have users that legitimately need to move to another port and they're not breaking any of those first 2 violations that are in that first bullet point. But what Cisco iOS is going to do is by default shut down that port if it sees that MAC address on two different ports in the same VLAN, both running port security. There is a way around that using port security aging time, and we'll see that in a couple of slides. But do keep this behavior in mind for the real world, because again, this is something you're like, what? I don't understand why that would shut that down. So here are our security violation modes, and there's 3 of these bad boys. And unlike the last bit that I just talked about, this is almost guaranteed to appear in some form on your Cisco exam, so memorize these. So recall that the security violation is going to be invoked when any of those 3 situations that we just described occur. The maximum number of MAC addresses per port is exceeded. A MAC address appears on a port that is not in that port's list of secure MAC addresses, or that third issue that we talked about where a MAC address appears on 2 different ports in the same VLAN that are both running port security. Any of those 3 situations, it's going to invoke a security violation, and depending on what you have configured, one of these 3 guys will be the result of that violation. And we've got protect, restrict, and shut down. Shut down is default. We'll talk about that last. First up is protect, and as we'll see here, this is one that I would not recommend using. But what's going to happen is when you have a security violation, any traffic from unknown MAC addresses is going to be dropped at the port. So let's take the instance where you've configured the maximum number of MAC addresses for your port to be 1, and then a second MAC address appears on there. So that first MAC address, it's going to be fine. It's going to be able to send traffic. The second one, traffic from that second MAC address is going to be dropped. And the bad thing about protect is you don't really get an alert. You're not getting a syslog or anything that tells you why this is happening. So you're going to get a service call that comes in and says, I'm the boss and I can't get on the network. This is bullshit. Fix this. And you're going to go look at your port and be like, well, everything looks okay. I don't see anything in the logs. The port's up, blah, blah, blah. Unless you know to look at the port security. But I can't think of a good reason to use protect. The next one up is restrict, and this is basically protect. Same thing, except it's going to go ahead and give you an SNMP trap and also a syslog. So the same feature as protect. It's going to drop the traffic from that unknown MAC address, but you're going to get something that tells you what's going on. So if you have an SNMP server set up, you'll get that trap. You'll have a syslog, so you might have remote syslogging. At the very least, you have a syslog message that, hopefully you've got local logging set up. So you're going to have a paper trail so that you can go ahead and quickly see that something is awry with the boss's port. And like I said, if you want to use protect, I don't see a reason why you wouldn't just use restrict instead, unless you want to limit the number of SNMP traps. Doesn't make a lot of sense to me. So of those 2, restrict is probably the one that you're going to end up using the most. Alright, and the last guy here is shutdown, and this is the default. So in this case, it's going to do exactly what it says. If there is a security violation, again for those 3 reasons that we already discussed, it's going to shut down the port. We'll go into a little more detail about shutdown versus error disable in a bit here, but for all intents and purposes, it's shutting down the port. No traffic is going to be passed. It's going to be, like I said, for all intents and purposes, shut down. The LED is going to go off. No traffic will pass, regardless of whether the source MAC address of that traffic is one of the MAC addresses in the port secure MAC address table or not. It's going to go ahead and shut this down. This is the default. As always, you have to weigh security versus usability. In this case, this is the most secure violation mode because it's shutting down everything. Nothing can pass through that port. So, just by definition, it's going to be the most secure. It's going to affect your usability though, and allow me a tangent here. If you are using shutdown as your security violation mode, make sure that your support staff knows this. Because what happens is that it shuts down, like I said, the LED light goes off. What ends up happening if you're not aware of this, the trouble will be reported to the help desk, and they might look at this initially as a cabling issue. Then they look at the cabling and they go to the switch port, and you got a monkey sitting in front of the switch, and he says, well, this is a bad port, the light's off. Let me go ahead and move this to another port. Well, that's going to just go ahead and disable that port. So you could have, say you had 10 available ports all running port security, and the desktop guy or whomever's on site just starts plugging that cable into the available ports. Unless something has materially changed to not invoke the security violation, then when he plugs into those other ports running port security, it's going to disable those. And in order to get out of this, you're going to have to go ahead and manually enable the port. In most cases, there is a way around that. We'll show you that. You need to know how this is going to work and what problems can occur with this, because this looks like a dead port. Like, a lot of guys will go in there, no light on the port. All right, well, this is a dead port. Let me move it to a different port.